Well, if you're just joining us, my guest is Nick Deitch. You're listening to Ventura's Leading Edge on KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM CAPS Radio. Well, Nick, I'd like to talk a little bit about pressing challenges facing Ventura. And before you came in today, I asked you to reflect a little bit on that. So I'm wondering, what do you think in your mind? And I know there could be a number of things, a number of ways this question could be answered. But if you had to identify one pressing challenge, what would that be?
Well, as most people who live in Ventura know, change here happens very slowly and with a lot of resistance. And the term slow growth gets used a lot. And slow growth is not necessarily a bad thing. I think we all have observed communities that have changed very rapidly and not necessarily for the better. So it isn't as much the pace of the growth as it is how clear we are about what it is we want to become. We're in the process constantly of becoming. It's never going to get finished. One of the things I like to do in my class is ask my students, what do you think Ventura is going to look like 500 years from now?
What a fantastic question.
It's fascinating to me. What is Ventura going to look like 500 years from now?
I mean, I feel challenged by what's it going to look like in 10 years.
Yeah.
And
here's the thing. 500 years from now, it will be a very different place. I hope that we would be able to walk around and identify things like, oh, there's the mission. I remember that building. Mm-hmm. I'm projecting myself into the future.
Course, yeah.
I do this probably too often. But 500 years from now, it won't just appear and be different. It's going to be a result of incremental change from now to then. And we're in the midst of it. We're doing it. We're creating change on a daily basis. How much of that change is conscious? How much of it have we asked ourselves, what is it we want 10 years from now? What is it we want 20 years from now?
Right.
Because everything that we're doing is incrementally bringing us to those places in the future. It's an ongoing story. And it's fascinating and it's wonderful, and we shouldn't be afraid of it.
So would you argue that, because there are people who would say, how it is now works and it's great. Let's not mess it up by changing it. But I would think that because of the passage of time, there's sort of an inherent change that occurs over time. And I'm not just talking about deterioration of physical structures, or need for maintenance, but that something is happening as we are moving forward through time in the space where we live. Even if we are not wanting to change the buildings or the things around us, there is sort of an inexorable process that is at work. It may not necessarily be dramatic or visible on a shorter time scale, especially if there's a resistance to putting in, say, new buildings. Mm-hmm. But it seems like the idea that we're not going to change things is sort of ignoring some kind of a fundamental reality.
Sure. And say that to a Chumash Indian. We aren't going to change things. The Padres, when they first got here, don't worry, we're just building just one building here. We're not going to change anything.
Okay.
No. This change has been going on since at least since the late 1700s. And all you have to do is drive from downtown Ventura to East Ventura, and what you will see is an urban archaeology of change over the decades as the community moved further and further eastward. And you can see in the downtown was developed between 1880 to 1900 on into 1930, 1940. It was very pedestrian-oriented. Cars were not dominant in the life of Venturans at that time.
Right.
So parking is limited. The streets are walkable. As you move further east, you get into territory that is more and more car-centric. And this particularly happens past 5 Points. But even before then, you see where buildings were, there was a Sears built. There was a Sears downtown. Then it was built in the Midtown. It's where Smart & Final is now. That was a Sears department store.
Okay.
And it had a much bigger parking lot. They moved there because they could build more parking, because in the 1940s, 1950s, cars were becoming quite prevalent. Then, of course, later they moved to the mall. And now you have a massive parking lot, and you have the building in the center of that. So my point being that we've been continually changing, and to think that we're not going to change anymore, it would be extremely naive. And I would argue that we need to change, that Ventura is not perfect. It's far from perfect. I would love to live in a community where I could ride my bike without risk of losing my life. I don't live in a community like that.
Yeah.
This is not a safe place to be a bicyclist.
Right.
And that's terribly unfortunate because there are a lot of people in this community, I think, that enjoy that and would benefit from being able to ride their bikes in different places. Now, how do we do that? That would require significant alteration of some of our main corridors to create separate bike paths. It can be done, and it's being done in communities all over. The other part of it is that as we drive through the community today, it's very common that we don't see a lot of things. 70% of our developed land in Ventura is set aside for storing cars. We drive
Did
through
you
it.
say 70%?
70% of the land in Ventura that's developed is set aside for parking.
I had never considered that the percentage was that high.
Get on Google Earth and take a look.
That's stunning
It is stunning.
when you actually put it in terms like that.
And we don't see it. We just drive through it.
Right.
So Google Earth's a wonderful tool to look at these things. If you take the shopping center where Winco is now,
Oh, sure. Wow, that's
it's
a huge
it's
lot.
a huge parking lot.
Right.
The town of Dubrovnik, this beautiful historic town, fits on that piece of land.
That really says a lot about what you can do with a small space,
Yeah.
and about how much space we waste. It's a luxury that we have in a country that's as large as ours is.
It's a luxury, but I would actually say that it's really a devastation. In all honesty, the car probably has been the most significant negative impact on our culture, on our health, on the way we live and experience life. And so what we've done is, cars are awesome, right? You buy a new car. Oh my gosh, you get into the thing and it's just wonderful. It's a little capsule. And you roll the windows up and it's quiet.
Right.
And it's got an amazing stereo system. And it practically drives itself. So you don't have to deal with any of that crap that's outside of the car.
Right.
You can go anywhere and you're safe and cool in your little capsule. And then what that means is our world can be crap. And it doesn't really matter because I'm going to go from my house to my job and I don't really care what I'm passing. I just got to get there as fast as I can.
Because I'm in a capsule that's
I'm in
as
a really
nice
cool,
as I can afford.
Yeah.
So let me ask, it's a long prelude to the original question. What would you say is the greatest challenge facing Ventura?
The greatest challenge is also the greatest opportunity, and that is learning how to become urbane. And in order to do that, we're going to need an economic strategy that makes sense, that helps us retain young professionals and young people. We're going to need to redefine what our housing looks like, because we're not going to be building a lot more single-family houses.
Yeah, there's not space.
And as I'm answering this, recognize that the city's growing at a rate of 1% per year, okay, in population. That's the baseline growth that the city's experienced over the last 40 years. 1% per year. And this is true pretty much for the whole county. This is happening on some level. But again, I don't see it as a negative. I see it as an opportunity for us to create places that people can be and can coexist. And I see it as more culture, as more energy, as more dynamic community. It's not a negative in my view.
And let me ask, in the limited time that we've got left, what sort of leadership would it take to make that, to realize the opportunity that you see there?
It's going to take people who are willing to ask questions that they don't necessarily understand or have the answers to. It's going to we're back to the beginning. It's going to take people who are willing to listen, to understand the challenges that we're facing, to understand that the leader, the person who's in the leadership role, doesn't necessarily represent the norm of the community. That they may have what they need and want, but that's not necessarily what the others in the community need and want. There are a lot of people who would choose not to live in a mixed-use urban setting, and I get that. They would prefer to have their single-family home or something in a less urban context. But there are people who would be very pleased and grateful to live in one of those more walkable urban settings. And there's no reason why a community like Ventura can't have a mix of those things. And there's a vision for the community that does begin to describe that. Our general plan talks about it some, about the idea of creating walkable pedestrian districts and nodes throughout the community. Ideally, from my view, those occur along some of the main corridors, and they're connected by transit, because ultimately, one of the answers to reducing our parking problem and making it more bike-friendly in this community is to get people to use transit. Malls are changing.
Sure.
And the purpose of malls is changing. And we have this amazing piece of property in the middle of our Midtown area
right.
that is going to change over the next 30 years. What's that look like? What should happen there? There are a number of pieces of property like that throughout the community that have worked for what they were in the last 40 years, but the next 20 years or so, their purpose is going to shift. What does that look like? What do we want from those places? The Johnson Drive area has struggled since day one. River Park comes along and the collection gets built, and we lose our theaters.
Right.
So interestingly, therein is a huge opportunity. How do we, instead of piecemealing that thing and trying to patch it, let's rethink it. Let's do something with Johnson Drive that is remarkable, that is a complement to what's going on over at River Park. It's really a subset. Just because there's a political boundary between the two things doesn't mean there needs to be a social boundary between them.
And so what would you say to somebody who wanted to be involved in producing the kind of change that you're talking about? What steps could your average Venturan take to be involved in helping realize the kind of opportunities that you're seeing for our community?
That's a tough question. I don't know how much the average Venturan wants to deal with that stuff. There are unique Venturans who are really concerned about it and very passionate about it. And I would suggest to get involved in the dialogue, you've got to be passionate about it. You've got to really want to delve into it. Now, ideally, and we've done this in the past, the community has had a number of opportunities for community dialogue and workshops. And in those workshops, pretty much anybody can go and listen and participate and share their views. Every 10 years, we have to retool and update our general plan. The last time we did it seriously was at the end of the 90s, where we had very significant community workshops, a lot of community participation, and a resulting vision that came out of that is still in force right now. And now these documents are available online from the city. It takes some interest and some passion to delve into them and sift through them. But there's a document called the Ventura Vision Document, which is a very accessible document. It's not full of planarese. It's written with good old plain ordinary English, and it talks about our healthy city, our social city, our recreational city, our economically viable city. It has all these different components to it about how Venturans visioned our community 15 years ago. How much has that changed or evolved? And it should continue to evolve. So there is an opportunity in this process for the community to participate. We have to make sure that the civic leaders recognize the need to do that and are open to supporting that effort. And I believe they are. I know that the city staff is supportive of that process.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me this afternoon and share your thoughts on Ventura. I really appreciate your insight and perspective. I think the listening approach that you take to leadership is a good lesson for all of us to remember and think about as we're contemplating change and complexity.
My pleasure, James.
Well, my guest today has been Nicholas Deitch, architect, teacher, writer, friend to many. For more engaging dialogue about leadership and how local leaders are impacting Ventura's most pressing challenges, tune in next time to Ventura's Leading Edge.